Hi, welcome to our presentation on the structure of the brain and how it changes in old age. This is the brain. The brain is a powerful organ that plays a huge role in our ability to process language, move, speak, think, and so much more. But in order to really understand how the brain accomplishes these things, you have to start by understanding a little bit about the structure of the brain. Here's a 3D model of the brain so you can start to get a feel for how it looks from each angle. But we're really going to begin our journey into the structure of the brain by going to the cellular level. We're going to go into the neuron, the main cell type of the brain. We have billions of these neurons in our brain, communicating with each other and processing information to enable all kinds of different functions. On the left here, we have the cell body. Now, the cell body of each neuron, you'll see, has all these spikes connecting to it. And these spikes are actually bringing in information from other neurons, which will be processed in the cell body. Once the neuron has processed its information, it will send it out to other neurons through this long tendril called the axon. Now, this axon is going to connect to many other neurons in all of these branching pathways called the axon terminals. Each terminal is going to connect to another neuron. Now, we have a variety of different types of neurons in our brain, but most of them are going to follow this kind of general structure. Let's zoom back out to the outside of the brain. In this lecture, we're going to be focusing on the forebrain, also called the cerebrum. It's the largest portion of the brain, and it's covered by this wrinkled pink exterior. This is probably what you think of when you hear the word brain. It's the classic image, this pink wrinkled surface. The parts of the brain that bulge outwards are called the gyri, or singular gyrus. So these parts that bulge outwards. And then the parts that dip inwards are called the sulci, or singular sulcus. But why does our brain have the structure with gyri and sulci? Well, the brain has, as we said, has billions of neurons. And in order to cram all of those neurons into a very small space, our head, the brain has to be crammed in and folded up to maximize the surface area while still fitting in our head. So in other words, this wrinkly pattern allows the brain to have a much bigger surface while still fitting inside of our head. Now, the forebrain could be further split into 4 sections called lobes. We have the frontal lobe here, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Each lobe roughly deals with different types of information, but the lobes will also work together and communicate with each other in order to process information. Now we're going to open up the brain to look inside and learn more about the structure inside the brain. But first, let's take a look at the different ways we can open up the brain. If we were to cut the brain into left and right pieces, you would be able to see into the side of the brain like this. If you were to cut the brain into top and bottom pieces, you could look down onto the surface of the brain like this. And if you were to separate the brain into front and back pieces, you'd be able to look at the surface of the brain like this, the interior of the brain like this. You can imagine that a person's face, the front of their head is right here, and the back of their head is right here. And we've opened up the brain to look like this. This is a view we're going to be using. So here we've got the brain in that view. And what might jump out at you immediately is how we have this gray exterior portion, this wrinkled part. This is called the gray matter, and it corresponds to the pink outer surface that we saw earlier. Notice how it has those wrinkles and dips and bulges. Meanwhile, inside the gray matter, we have this white portion called the white matter. It's larger and it connects the gray matter. Let's think back to the structure of the neuron. Remember, we have our neuron cell bodies here and the long axons here. Well, the cell bodies of each neuron actually comprise the gray matter. The gray matter is made up of mostly neuron cell bodies. Meanwhile, the white matter is mostly comprised of neuron axons. So remember, the axons allow the neurons to communicate with other neurons. And the white matter is mostly comprised of axons. So another way to think of it is that in rough terms, the white matter connects different parts of the gray matter to allow parts of the gray matter to communicate with each other. And on the inside, we also have this ventricle colored blue in this diagram. This is a space in the brain that's filled with a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. So now that we understand a little bit more about the structure of the exterior and interior of the brain, let's talk about how those things change as we age. As we age, especially from adulthood to older adulthood, our brains begin to degrade in certain ways. It's very natural. It happens to everyone. On the left here, we have a brain from a young male, 25 years old. And on the right, we have the brain of a older male, 68 years old. Try and pause the video and see which differences immediately jump out to you between the two brains. You might start by looking at the gray matter. If you look here, you can see that in the younger brain, the gray matter is actually quite a bit thicker in most places than it is in the older brain. You can see the gray matter looks pretty thin here. That's very common. As we age, our gray matter will shrink. A similar thing happens to our white matter. You can see how it looks fuller in the young brain, but it seems to have shrunk and recoiled a little bit in the older brain. Let's think back again to the structure of our neuron. We have the neuron bodies, which make up the gray matter, and the axons, which make up the white matter. As we age, many of our neurons die. It's a natural process, but the death of our neurons means that we have fewer neuron bodies in the gray matter and fewer axons in the white matter. So naturally, those parts of the brain are going to shrink. So neuron death is one of the main reasons why we see gray and white matter shrink. You may also notice that the ventricles in the old brain are much larger than the ventricles in the young brain. This is another very common effect of aging. You see the ventricles have swelled with that cerebrospinal fluid, and they've gotten much bigger and wider. So how can we protect our brains from the effects of aging? Everybody ages, but people age at different rates, and their brains atrophy or become worse at different rates. The best way to protect your brain from the effects of aging is to simply lead a healthy lifestyle. Exercise and eating a diet high in fresh fruits and vegetables or fatty fish like salmon will all help protect your brain from the effects of aging. You also want to try and avoid, or at least minimize, processed meats and table sugar. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you learned a lot about the structure of the brain, and I hope you enjoy the rest of these lectures.